Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Struckoff. I'm with IDCA. I'm Director of Research and Editor-in-Chief. And we have a panel that's going to start here in a few minutes. I'm going to let everyone get in and get comfortable and get settled. And we will start talking officially here in a minute or two. We will take a break at the bottom of the hour for 5 minutes, but only 5, because this hour will go by very, very quickly. So the subject today is digital infrastructure and sustainability. And we have 3 panelists who have joined us. We have David Sassano with Accrue Architects. We have Ori Carmel with Sowen. And we have Steve Beber joining us from London with Assetspire. So welcome, everybody. David, I see, is still muted, but he's not now because he wanted to keep the background noise out. But now he's there, which is understandable. Anyway, if our producer could show a slide 1, I'd like to start the conversation with that. It's a little bit of misdirection, but I want to set the scope for people. Global emissions, as everybody knows, is a big issue, and there are certain things that some of us can do about it, and certain things we can't. So you look at these figures are about 18 months old, but the current figures have not fundamentally changed. If you look at the top 10 producers of CO2, and then you add maybe another 10% for the other greenhouse gases. You look at the top 10 world producers, you can see China is more than twice the number 2 country, which is the United States, which is more than twice the number 3 country, which is India. And then the top 10 countries produce 70% of all the global emissions. On a per capita basis, per person basis, you can see that the oil nations generally are very major producers of this stuff, and that's just the nature of the beast. But both Canada and the US are in the top 10. It always amuses me to see that the US is actually a little more efficient than Canada, but Canada does have a relatively big petroleum industry. If we could look at the second slide, please. If you look at economic efficiency instead of per capita, which is what I like to do, at IDCA, we do this metric where we say how much CO2, how many greenhouse gases, how many tons are being produced per $1 million of nominal, of real gross domestic product. And that way you kind of see what kind of bang you're getting for the buck. You can see what's going on here. The world average is 360 tons, metric tons per $1 million in GDP. The top 10, and that's actually could be the bottom 10, these are the worst, again, kind of shows oil companies and some kind of troubled places in the world. If you look at the top 10 overall producers, you can see the United States is down there at number 9 at a little more than half, a little more than half of what the world average is. And so that shows you that the United States is not necessarily the worst actor throughout the world. Not that it maybe should be an exemplar, but it's by far from the worst actor. And in fact, if we could show slide 3, we'll do that at this point. If the rest of the world would actually so-called catch up to the United States, we'd reduce emissions on the spot 37%. If just China would reach the United States level, we'd have a reduction of 20%, just like that. And as I mentioned to the panelists before we started, the leaders of the USA and China are meeting today out in San Francisco, and they're going to talk about a bunch of things. They're not going to talk about this. They didn't ask my opinion, but I think they should, because this is a global problem, and you have to keep economies in mind. As we battle CO2 and we try to reduce emissions throughout the world, and we try to adopt cultures of sustainability, we have to be aware that economic development is never going to go away. It's important. People have to eat, people have to live and raise their families, and we just have to keep that in mind. Okay, with that in mind, let's get back. We can get rid of the slides and we'll start the discussion, because I'd like to live in the real world for the rest of the hour. I'm going to start with Steve. You do audits, and from what you've told me before we started, you're finding that not all data centers are maybe as well run and efficient as they could be. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, look, we've been auditing data centers for over 15 years, and we've never walked into a data center that's above 60% accuracy on what assets they actually own, what's actually being utilized within the environments. And what it indicates to us is that there's a delta of equipment that is running and being consuming power, consuming cooling, taking space, etc., within these facilities that's just not being accounted for. So when decisions are being made around capacity, around utilization, even carbon footprint, and finger in the air is being done to try and associate that, it's not being done on accurate data. It's being done on very stale data. And that's that causes a big problem, because obviously decisions are made upon accuracy and quality of data.
Well, now your company at some point says you focus on sort of new DCIM or new DSIM. Is that accurate description, and what does that really entail?
So we kind of reverse engineer what you need as a DSIM from thinking, the nuts and bolts of what most companies or organizations need is asset management. But they don't just need an ability to collect, a one-time view of what they've got. They need a process, a mechanism that's intuitive enough to maintain accurate data daily basis through moves and change, decommissioning, through planned preventative maintenance, all of that kind of tracking that goes on.
How much stuff do you find that just needs to be turned off if people are afraid to turn it off?
So a vast amount, and it's crazy. I mean, we do a lot of work in the telecom space, and the telecom space is probably one that's got a lot of problems, because inherently it's grown through acquisition. A lot of these telcos have bought each other up over the years and acquired stuff they don't even know exists or where it is. Technology has evolved from being traditional, exchanges into now video content streaming and all the different services they provide. But there's still a lot of equipment that sits on the shelf that no one wants to turn off, because they don't know what it does.
Right. They don't want planes to fall from the sky.
Absolutely.
Now, David, you live in the most densely populated data center region in the world, Northern Virginia area, and you're architecting these things, you're building these things. What's been your experience? Because I think you may believe that maybe things are better off than what Steve may be saying.
Well, I don't want to disagree with you. I have a take on that and a perspective on it. So to react to Steve's comment, that one of the challenges we face, and we just had a meeting this morning on a CFD analysis of a site, and we were looking at the computational fluid dynamics, where you run the wind to see if the generators are all turned on, running 100%, and all the data is running at 100%. And it's the hottest day of the year, and all the rooftop units are running at 100%. What happens? Now, let me ask you, Steve, what's the likelihood of that ever happening?
Zero.
Yeah. But as a designer, we have to design to those metrics, right? And I think one of the challenges, which I hear now is being dealt with, and I can give you an example of some of the stuff in Virginia here too with power, is that as the companies, as the grid gets more redundant, and the feeling that the operators have that the worst case Armageddon scenario isn't really going to happen because we could just move data, for example, those criteria will get softer, and I think it'll be easier to handle risk. But for the most part, the building is designed to accommodate that absolute, that it's the hottest day of the year. I'm in a data center where all my data center is needed for some emergency operation that's just engaged because we just lost all the power in Northern Virginia, right? And nobody wants everything to go down. So, that's one of the realities of the design process today.
But one of the problems with that, though, is
pulling back a little bit, though.
One of the problems with that, though, David, is a building can be really well designed, but it could be really poorly managed. So no matter how much work and effort goes into the architecture and the design of a building, if the day-to-day management of that building isn't being managed correctly in line with how it's been designed, then it doesn't matter how good the design is, it's poorly managed, so it's not going to be efficient.
Now, Ori, you develop projects all over the world, and you don't want any of your customers, I would imagine, to be sort of bad guys when it comes to sustainability. What do you do about that? What's been your experience?
Well, we try to stay at the strategic level, right? Both David and Steve know more about carbon emissions at the tactical level. They've probably forgotten more than I will ever know. What we do is help companies, organizations, governments at the nonprofit and profit side design better strategies that leverage real data and technology.
Right.
So they design those strategies, implement them, and then most importantly, measure the outputs of those new tools, technologies, projects that they.
But it must be frustrating. You try to explain this sometimes to, say, politicians who may not be aware or may be willfully unaware of the implications of what they're doing.
Yeah, well, we operate within the reality within which we walk into, right? And each one of those realities has its own set of constraints and pressures. What we try and do first and foremost is identify the good actors, right? If you are a truly purposeful organization that isn't just checking the boxes. I mean, we talked about this previously. I think that there's a lot of virtue signaling. I think that there's a lot of, you see this not just in sustainability, an even better and more vivid example today is DEI, right? Where we've had a lot of movement, a lot of good things happening, but at the same time, you see a lot of companies that just have a checklist and they say, okay, we appoint a person of color to the board, check, have this training check. You see the same with sustainability, right? Yeah. There's a checklist that gets created. And a lot of companies, organizations, even governments just go through and do the bare minimum without really thinking, am I actually going through the logic modeling of, thinking about the activities, inputs, outcomes, results, impact that we are generating? And they never get to the impact. They get stuck at activities and checking the box without really following the impact. And that, what we try and do is find the people and organizations that are actually interested in following through and work with them.
Well, Steve, the things that you're outlining, describe for me the range of the age of the facilities that you're visiting, and to what degree is age important?
It is important because, obviously legacy data centers are a lot, there's a lot of them out there. They're typically very difficult to upgrade and to change because, certainly if they're running operations like they're a telecoms infrastructure, for instance, and it's not something that can just be switched off or taken down for a period of time. There has to be a well thought out plan, migration structure around how they're going to get from one existing facility into a new. I think most of what we see, I don't think it's that old. I think the last 15 years, maybe the last 20 years of data centers, they're not aging as in some of the very early kind of telco rooms that we saw that were almost punch down bars everywhere. It's evolved significantly from that. But again, it's not necessarily down to the age of the environment. It's how well that environment's being run and how well it's being managed. If it's being managed well, then they'll have in-road cooling, or they'll have cooling blanking plates in place. They'll have airflow management. They'll have all of the basic stuff to ensure that they're utilizing the resource correctly, as efficiently as possible.
Right. Well, in doing that, David, you had mentioned that, so even a very large, powerful operator can't control the utilities. And in the area that you're living, which I think is not as extreme as it may seem, I think there's similar issues in other parts of the US and in countries such as Ireland and Denmark, which are small but have pretty massive footprints, digital infrastructure footprints. If you could describe a bit, okay, you go in with good intentions, you're designing this place, you're architecting your building, but getting the power to it seems to be an issue. Is that correct? And what do you do about it? Because
what do you do about it? Yeah, so in Northern Virginia, Yeah, in Northern Virginia, Dominion Electric provides most of the power. And I want to say it was about 2 years ago, there were a couple of projects that had their substations pretty close to being able to go live. And they informed the owners that there was no point in turning the substations on because the overhead lines didn't have the power from the generator companies. And there was a lot of consternation and WTFs and they, you begin to realize how complicated the utility infrastructure is behind the curtain and the different agencies that run things and make decisions and how long it takes. So, what I understand in my limited ability to see behind that curtain is that it's not so much a power generation problem, it's a power distribution problem. It's the high tension lines that aren't carrying the power to all these new substations, that we need. I mean, we're plopping 300 megawatt substations down, like their little backyard generators. I mean, they're just seem to be popping up everywhere. And, the area is looking probably 2 years down the road to sort of being back up to normal. But to the earlier point about how much of these buildings are actually being used, I mean, I've heard statistics that Northern Virginia is 35% occupied, but everybody's signing SLAs for full power load. So what do you do when you're an owner committing, 100 megawatts, and even though they're only using 30, can you take some of that extra power and maybe send it somewhere else? And a little bit of that is happening actually between the owners and the operators. And so that's one way that they're skirting through it. But the other interesting thing, regarding power generation too, is if you look at all the different things that are being talked about now with the mini nuclear reactors or modular nuclear reactors,
right,
and cogeneration, and the necessity will drive that innovation. And I think we're going to be seeing some big innovations.
Hold that thought. That's something that we should talk about. I want to get the survey questions going. We have some survey questions. I want to ask our audience too. Use the chat. Send us comments and questions if you have based on your world. If we don't get to them, we'll make sure that someone follows up with you if you have a question you'd like any of us to answer. But the survey, if we could produce the poll question number 1, how would you rate the current integration of sustainability practices in your organization's digital infrastructure? And we, so far, somewhat integrated is the early leader. Oh, I'm tipping the poll. I gotta wait till everyone finishes. Wow, no one said highly integrated. We have, okay, there. I tipped the poll again. Well, it looks like we're just about done. I can see the results here live. The panelists, can you see these results live? No, you cannot. Okay. No. I wanted to make sure that, in fact, you couldn't. So I'll tell you what's going on. How would you rate the current integration of sustainability practices in your organization's digital infrastructure? Highly integrated, 4%. Moderately integrated, 27%. Somewhat, 38%. So 65% say it's moderately or somewhat integrated. 33% say not, no, excuse me, 23%. 23% say not integrated. So that's 1 in 4 say not integrated. Most of the rest say moderately to somewhat, and 4% say highly, and 8% are in that category of not sure. That's actually a little more positive than I thought we'd see. Do we have question 2, please? Question 2. Question 2. In your opinion, what is the biggest challenge in achieving sustainable digital infrastructure? And we have 5 different choices. Biggest challenge. Challenge is a nice way to say, obstacle or something worse than that. So we're trying to be sustainable in all these organizations. All of our participants today are doing what they can, and at some point they run into challenges. Now, our experience with past polls, whenever we ask a question about challenges, the technical challenges are never the issue, and that's proving out here as well. In fact, only 7% say the technical challenges are a problem. Only 4% say regulatory hurdles. maybe because the actual regulations aren't that robust yet. 30% say lack of stakeholder commitment, which can also be like backsliding and backstabbing, right? 30% say that. The biggest problem is financial constraints. And so let's leave it with that. Ori, when you're doing projects, to what degree do financial constraints, play a role in doing what you want to do or what your client wants to do?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I didn't see this in advance, by the way, but
yeah.
I'm not surprised.
Oh, I know. No, I know. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I think it's interesting because I think those are the answers I would expect based on the options that you gave. I think if you added another option, it should. I would probably argue that it should be around incentives, right? My background is game theory, so I always try to understand what are the set of incentives that are going to cause people or organizations to act in a specific way, in the most favorable way to get the most that you want out of the situation. I think the real problem, the real challenge is one of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's shrinking. Time has been shrinking since, the Industrial Revolution, right? We know that. Attention spans, time horizons, and the dynamics that are created within companies, most companies who would be companies and organizations who would be using large data centers, create a very serious dichotomy, a very serious clash. On one hand, you have executive time horizons, which are very, very short. Executives at most companies are quarterly employees. They are held to in a very short leash to a board or a VC firm or somebody, or to their own desires to gain bonuses, et cetera, et cetera. And those are very short term. Those are quarterly, annual at best. So you have that on one side. Against that, you have the challenges that we are trying to solve with the solutions that are relevant for them, which do not happen in the same time frames. These solutions do not happen in quarterly frames. They cannot be measured in quarterly frames.
Right.
So it's a question of interest. The individuals at power who have the ability to dedicate more time, commitment, resources, funding, et cetera, don't always, and I would argue almost never, have the incentive to do so. In fact, they are pressured to do the exact opposite, which is focus on short-term gains at the expense of long-term sustainability. And I don't know if that's the entire problem. I'm sure that there are other elements, but I think that is at the core and isn't spoken about almost ever.
So like you're starting to get things like from off the ground. Now, Steve, when you're going in, how much is time, the lack of time, an issue? And related to that in your world, I think, is how well do people receive the bad news when you give it to them in terms of cost and time of getting to where to be?
I mean, twofold, really. From a point of view of how the time affects things, if people don't have time in their day jobs to maintain the quality and accuracy of data of what they've got within their environments, and updating the asset information so that they have good data to plan from, then, effectively that data goes out of date very quickly and it just becomes, unusable and not a benefit to the business. So time is a massive factor, and people just don't have enough time in their day jobs. But that's where intuitive software platforms, like our platform as a Spire platform, what that enables people to do is to use smartphone apps, use software in an intuitive way to maintain data as part of your day-to-day routine. So there are options to improve that, and there's ways to use solutions to improve time efficiencies, and increase efficiency on making decisions, because you're not having to do spot audits to go and check if something can fit in a rack or there's sufficient power. Instead, you're looking at a screen and looking at doing a search to see, let me look at the rack elevation for that rack and see what it looks like. Is there space, power, cooling capacity there?
Right, but I mean, you're basically saying, look, if you don't have the time and the funding to do this right, then what are you doing
There's got to be a want and a will to want to make it right, and the problem is, I think it does come back down to money. There's an investment needed from day one to get something like this in place, and there's an investment in time, in resources to train them and ensure that they're managing this properly, and there's a duty to put this kind of solutions as part of people's KPIs, so that they're enforced to have data accuracy.
Right.
The important part is it's the resources that you're utilizing, and if you can't manage and track what you've got, then you're blind. You're running a data center blind.
Yeah. Now, David, I think you told me a parking lot story the other day, which we may or may not want to tell, but we could have incentive be part of the financial constraints, but to what degree do you get involved with there's incentives or unlikely things like some commissioner wants a bigger parking lot than you actually need? How, to what degree does that kind of interfere with the good work that you're trying to do with people?
Well, yeah, I mean, incentives, it's a great topic. I have a different perspective on the role of incentives in what we see from our perspective. And the three legs of the stool, right, are the builder, the owner of the building, the operator, and then the public, whether that's the jurisdictions or just public presence. I mean, the people who live nearby. And they just had a 24-hour meeting here where a group of people sort of shut down, what was, I think, going to be the largest data center campus in the world. So, but I sort of take a step back in our role as apologists for the data center industry, as we're trying to convince the local jurisdictions and politicians that these are good things, is to point out that from the perspective of incentive, the data center industry is so well aligned between capitalistic and technical pursuits, right? Because on one hand, what is the goal of the data center builder operator? It's what are they selling? They're selling power, right? They're not selling square footage. They're selling kilowatts. And what is the customer doing? He's trying to process as much data as he possibly can with those kilowatts. So his incentive to technically advance so he can produce more data with the same power is high. The data center industry's incentive to maximize the power that goes to the data, not to the data center, but to the data, is absolutely maximized. And so that reality is what drives the industry at its core. Challenges of time are because data is needed way too fast, and we're not, keeping up with it technologically. Again, there's all kinds of people doing fantastic research on new methods for cooling, new methods for processing data, new methods for servers operating at a higher speed and with more heat. But they're constantly up against the clock. But they're highly incentivized, from our perspective.
Let's take a look at the poll questions again, and then we're going to go to break. Number 3, please. Let's answer a couple questions. We'll go to break. We'll come back and pick this up where we left off. Does your organization prioritize greenhouse gas abatement in its digital infrastructure operations? So is it a high priority or not so much a priority to address greenhouse gases? And now this one is interesting in that the unsure option is not just a throwaway. This is something where a lot of people are actually not really sure of what they're doing. So this is interesting across the board. Does your organization prioritize GHG abatement in its digital infrastructure operations? 1/4, 27% said yes, it's a high priority. 14% said, yeah, it's a priority, but not a top one. 36% said, nope, not a priority. And 23% said they're just not sure. So 60% of the respondents here have said that it's either not a priority or it's not something they're really aware of. So that's an interesting thing. And then question 4, please, we put that up, and then we're going to go to break. We'll come back and address all this. let's look at question 4. How important do you believe sustainable infrastructure is in the development of digital economies? This is one where we're playing to the crowd. I'll tip this poll. We want a positive answer here because this is what we do at IDCA. How important do you believe? Well, of course it's important. You know, we're getting a pretty unambiguous result here. Yeah, there's no one saying not important. That's good. Okay, so it's extremely important, 52%, and important, so 92% of the people say it's important, and nobody said that it's not important. But again, that might relate back to Ori's point of, yeah, it's on the checklist, and we're waving our hands and saluting and all that. So we're going to go to break right now, and we will be back in 5 minutes. I hope not 6. We will be back in 5 minutes and take any questions that the audience has, and we'll resume our conversation then. Thank you for participating. We'll see you in 5 minutes. There it is. I actually talked during the break for people that are participants that are listening. Just do a little conversation with the panelists to discuss what we're saying.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, but you can take a break as well, just so you know. Go ahead and do that. Our participants are looking at a beautiful graphic of all of our faces. And yeah, please, everyone take a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. There's somebody back. About 3 more minutes, we'll resume.
No worries.
Yeah.
I'm wondering,
People
first of all,
can hear it, so you know.
I don't know if participants can still see us. I think that they can.
They can hear us, but they cannot see us right now. They can hear us.
I wonder if there's an opportunity to go back to David's point, because I think it's a really interesting one. I think that there are incentives, but they stay at the tactical level rather
No,
than.
I was going to start the second half by asking you that exact question. So yes, yeah. I do want to return to that. In that respect, yes, absolutely. I've got a real clever way of asking the questions too. I think we'll find out.
No worries at all.
Yeah, maybe back. Okay, I'm gonna leave for 1 minute, and we'll resume in 2 minutes.
I gotta tell you, my son is in Copenhagen. He's got a little data center consultancy he's just started up. He would probably like talking to both of you guys. Both seem to be interested in data, which is what it's all about.
Nice, yeah.
Good thing.
Absolutely.
Steve, where in the UK are you?
Well, I'm in London at the moment, but I actually live in Sweden. I live in Gothenburg.
Okay.
just recently moved.
That's
I
right.
saw Sweden from Copenhagen.
Yeah, I bet, yeah.
I looked across the water and there it was.
Yeah. The most sustainable city in the world.
Yeah.
A cool place.
Yeah, in more ways than one.
Yeah, it's cold there in the wintertime. I had a friend that lived there.
It's -4 at the moment, but it's, yeah, it gets cold.
I had an English friend who lived there, and he said it was cold.
Yeah.
He said it was more. He said the winter was more drab than England, which he thought was the gold standard. Oh, yes, it's a beautiful place. We're not saying bad about Copenhagen. Okay, we're back. We're going to resume here as soon as our producer will show our smiling faces here in a second, and we will resume. And there we go. We are back. I'm looking at a question here. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. Thank you for the question from one of our panelists. I wanted to ask Ori, we're talking about incentives a little bit over the break. Ori, you've done business with politicians in Italy and Greece, for example, which I don't want to disrespect anyone's country, but that has to be a difficult process. So how do you sort of balance like the incentives and then the metrics that you want to show compared to what your client may want to show? How do you work in all that in these environments?
Yeah, great question. That wasn't set up during the break at all. But no,
I was gonna anyway. That's exactly what I wanted to know.
It's a really good question. It goes back to Steve's comments earlier about, and I think you're right, Steve. The incentives do exist and they are aligned. They're just aligned. Oftentimes, they are aligned in the wrong place. So if you look at the data center at the tactical level, right, they're incentivized to push the data out as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. The person who's going to be using the data is incentivized to receive the data and use it as efficiently as possible. I think the challenge becomes, and this is where I start answering your question, Roger, there's a third party involved, and that third party is the actual decision maker. And that oftentimes is either the C-level or the politician. So from my experience, when you start dealing with those parties, they don't care. They don't even look at it. It's not even on their radar, right? So for example, we work with cities. I'm not going to mention any names, but when most CTOs of cities that I work with, or large organizations, when they look at, how do they want to configure their next data center? How do they want to build the architecture around it? How does this all come together? The question of emissions isn't even on their radar. It's a much, like I mentioned earlier, a much shorter time horizon decision for them, oftentimes led by budgets. And unfortunately, that's just the reality. So that's been my experience. I think that the alignment still happens at the bottom, and that's fantastic. It doesn't trickle up, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, as we're also discussing some cities, we mentioned Copenhagen, but also Singapore and Madrid, and even where I lived in Makati, Metro Manila, Philippines, will tell you front and center in their websites and their pronouncements how, they're the world's most sustainable city, the world's greenest city, the this and that and the other thing. So there's a high level thing going on there, but when you're getting down to project management, maybe not as much, or more a lack of awareness than anything else.
So three problems with that. One, they're few and far between, right? Two, there's a lot of statements. There's a lot less actual demonstration of tangible metrics. There's also, which is to a degree understandable, right? These things take time. And three, those activities aren't happening. Going back to your first slide, those activities aren't happening in the places that pollute the most.
Yes. Okay. Let's get the next slide up. Speaking of that, we have one more slide to look at. And speaking of what you were just saying and what David was saying and what Steve was saying, let's get the fourth slide up if we could, which is a very simple slide. Put this as simply as I could. These are the goals of the big guys. This is what they're going to do. Now, the first two, seem to be pretty similar, except the year is different. Amazon has said 2040, not 2030. Apple is going to have all their products carbon neutral by 2030, which means they're saying they're going to take responsibility for their whole, people are saying value chain, but Apple's going to take responsibility for all the stuff that's going on in China and Taiwan. Microsoft, never really amenable to having a very simple slogan, is they're going to take all of their company emitted carbon out by 2050. Netflix is going to cut their emissions in half, and Google's going to basically do the same thing that Facebook is saying. So that's what they're saying. I think everyone's aware of these sort of statements, and there's a lot of countries where the governments have pronounced similar goals. The thing I see in common with this and with many of the country goals, and we can take the slide down now. Thank you for that. Go ahead and take it down and show us again. Okay, is the year 2030. And I think a lot of these goals, as I recall, were made a few years ago when 2030 may have seemed a little bit distant. It's not distant. It's going to be 2024 here real soon. So Steve, what do you think of this sort of goal setting that they do? Do your customers do it? Do people follow it? Do you discuss it? What do you make of all that besides the, inevitable, oh yeah, sure they are?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to me, a lot of it's just another form of greenwashing. It's just another form of saying, yeah, we're doing stuff and we've got these goals, but how they're going to get to those goals isn't actually being publicized and demonstrated. I think, the reality for most of these organizations, they'll find loopholes, they'll find ways of being able to say that they are reducing, but then actually not, and they're not putting the process in place. There's one on that list that I know, and I won't mention who, but I know for sure that they're not even doing the basics today. Okay. And they're not even recording the assets at a level that they should be today to start that program. You can't get a foot on the ladder if you don't know what you've got, if you're just chucking kit into data centers and filling them up and on to the next one, build a new one, fill it up with capacity and on to the next. It just doesn't work. So, for me, unless there's any, real depth of information around how they're going to deliver that, it's just another marketing scam. It's just something else that's out there.
And to be fair, for people in the audience, I'm sure have visited these websites, but you can visit them. And there are some companies that you'll see pretty detailed sorts of plans going on and operations that are happening. And just yesterday, Intel issued a new statement, and their CEO, Pat Gelsinger, is a fairly straightforward person, and I think he means well, and Intel is going to do all sorts of good things too. It's kind of a massive battle on one hand, but as we were discussing, these big companies control maybe half of the world's data flows, so it's critical. I wanted to ask David what you make of all that, but in the context of a question that we have. So this one, I hope it's not too big a surprise. I don't think it will be. Someone has asked what you were discussing, David. How do you maximize the data by kilowatt? How do you do that, and how does sustainability play a role? And if somehow you could answer that also in the context of these high-level goals that companies are mentioning, how does that interact with your?
Well, in my world, we have a metric when we design a building called watts per square foot. When we started this 10 years ago, we were at 125 watts a square foot. Mm-hmm. Within a couple of years, it went to 150 watts a square foot. And these are like the big, wholesale people, right? And it kind of hung there and started creeping up to 200 watts a square foot over the next few years. And today, we're looking at 250 watts a square foot, which means, that's sort of an average. I can sort of put the racks in my data hall. Some will be more, some will be less, but that's a safe average. And so what that affects is how many megawatts of power I can bring into the building, right? If I have 100,000 square feet of area and I calculate 150 watts a square foot or 300 watts a square foot, well, that 300 watts a square foot allows me to bring twice as much electricity in. That means I have to cool
generate
twice
more
as
heat.
right. I have to cool twice as much. I have to bring twice
Right.
as much electric gear, all of that. But so we have to find the spaces for that as we design these buildings. But the indication is clear. It's that the equipment, the reason these are being built to house all of this data equipment are becoming more and more efficient every day. And now, the next talk is bringing liquid cooling agents directly to the racks, whether it's inside the box itself or in the back of the rack door or whatever. And that's going to be a really interesting transition, because eventually it will change the shape of a data center. I mean, if you design a data center today to accommodate only liquid cooling, it would look completely different. Now, that's probably not going to happen because only some servers will accommodate the high intensity of liquid cooling. Right. So, I mean, is it the highest it possibly can be? No, it'll never be there because we're constantly trying to improve it. But like I said earlier, we don't have the time to go through an R&D phase and come up with the latest, greatest server. We have to do it today because the data need is today. And so it's an industry that says, is this the best we can do today, knowing that tomorrow we'll be able to do better? The incentives to continue to develop that are certainly present.
Yeah, as the conversation's going on here, someone else said that he or she noticed that in our industry, they changed the definitions in the contracts and the legislation to agree with someone else's policy. Tell me that ain't so. Ori, that's been your experience, I'm sure, but how do you deal with kind of these changing definitions? And it's actually a question for everyone, but I'll start with Ori. How do you do that while just kind of remaining true to what you believe you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. I think it's a real challenge. I think, Steve was mentioning it earlier in companies' essential inability to reach the goals that they set for themselves. So they just reset the goalpost every time, right? It's the same thing, right? It's resetting the policy to fit to a reality that we declared we're going to try and reach and didn't reach for whatever reasons. And we can argue about the reasons. I stated what I think is the main reason. And it's a real challenge. I think it's important to try and find, again, the individuals, organizations, whether they're in the government, third sector, nonprofit, foundation, philanthropic side, or on the private sector, who are truly committed. I also think it's important to mention that it's not a black and white issue. Goals do change sometimes. It's important to stay. But it's also very important to know when are we starting to bend the goals to fit the reality that we did or did not achieve versus when are we actually making incremental small changes to adjust to a constantly dynamic reality around us.
Right.
My fear is we do very little of the latter and a whole lot of the former.
Well, with respect to changing definitions, so Steve, I think you've made the point to me before we were talking, before the webinar and now during it, that in the real world these people live, they have to meet the demand of their customers. God forbid TikTok slows down or Facebook pauses. I mean, you got to keep everything moving or the customers are just going to eat you alive.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're going to eat
someone. That's supply and demand, isn't it? I mean, it comes back down to what we were saying earlier. Is if you can get to start managing down to what's the watts per processing that you're gaining from your facility, and how do you start to track what you're doing today, so you can actually measure any initiatives you put in place to prove that you're actually optimizing, to prove that you're being more efficient. And you're actually making a difference by, trying to do the right thing. And this is, when we talk to customers about starting that journey, it's about you have to put a stake in the ground at some point, and you have to say, listen, if we can get our data accurate today, then we can start to measure and monitor what we're doing, and we can see the net effect of that and in data, so that you can actually see incremental changes you might make and what the effects are and the improvements that you're delivering within your organization.
Well, that leads me, David, let me ask a real obvious question that, because I don't deal with this. I don't do this, but you do. When someone comes to you with a new project, what is it that they're trying to achieve? You know, we want X number of megawatts, or we have this much more data than we had, or you know, how does that? What's the
yeah?
question?
So at a very high level, very simplistically, they have a plot of land and they want to get as many megawatts out of that parcel as possible.
Corn in that field,
the more the better. The more megawatts, the better. And the interesting thing is, you know, I think it was I got into this industry in about 2013, and maybe a year later, I went to one of the conferences, and somebody mentioned this thing called the edge, and they had to explain to half the people there what that meant. And you know, the anticipation was that in a very short period of time, we'd have all of these very small data centers just ubiquitously spread across the country. So we recently started a project with somebody who's trying to start up sort of one of these edge companies, and the building started out as 12 megawatts, I think, which is exponentially bigger than anybody would have thought 5 years prior. And now we're trying to figure out how to get 24 megawatts in the same footprint.
Yeah.
And that's a little edge data center, you know. So the need for power is just growing exponentially, and our three-dimensional physical challenge is to maximize that. How do you eject the heat? Where do you put the generators? You know, how many spaces do you need for your electric distribution gear? And what's interesting is that space for the data center, the equipment is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And you're going to need more and more and more infrastructure. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but we're kind of excited to try to figure that out.
So that 24 megawatts is enough,
and that's small, right?
Residential needs of about 100,000 people if you have people per household.
But you know, the 100 megawatt data center now is kind of like average. It's pretty common.
So that trend's. I mean, Steve, you don't see that trend changing. I mean, the data's just growing and growing, right?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, if anything, it's going the other way, isn't it? With the introduction of autonomous cars and AI and all of the different kind of technologies that are evolving. I mean, it's just going to keep multiplying year on year. So absolutely not. It's a bigger problem.
I heard a statistic that we're going to need twice as many data centers as we have today in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Well, think about that.
My big thing is I look at the developing world, and the disparity between the number of servers per capita around the world is the biggest disparity there is. It's a larger disparity than income disparity, than certainly the number of mobile devices, not very disparate in the world. The lower countries are surprisingly close to the more developed countries. But when it comes to the servers, man, you think twice as many. Some of these countries could use 10, 15, 50 times as many.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that as the network grows and as the technology of moving data through fiber grows, where the data resides isn't as important as access to it, right? I mean, you're landing deep sea cables constantly connecting the continents. So as long as I'm somewhere in the grid and I can access that data, you know, I can achieve the kind of, you know, sort of equity that data should be able to bring to some of these remote locations. It's one of the exciting things about the industry.
Ori, you've got something to say on this.
Yeah, I actually have if it's okay, a question to my fellow panelists. I think we can all agree, right, like that one of the keys to making progress here is to tie the ecological incentives or goals or objectives to the business goals and objectives, right? Whether for companies or governments. What is your perspective on how to best do that? What are you excited about that is going to happen, or you think is going to happen, or could happen in the next 5 years, that is going to allow us to do that in a more effective way?
Steve?
I think from my point of view, I think there needs to be more incentives by governments to help enforce companies to be more efficient with what they're doing and how they're processing. And, you know, there are law changes going on at the moment around, in general, how data centers are managed, how their assets are managed, what they're reporting on from a consumption of utility point of view. But that needs to get more stringent, and there needs to be, it shouldn't necessarily be fines and and penalising companies, but it should be more looking at tax incentives and ways of making companies want to get on board and seeing the positive of it for more than just we need to do the right thing because we want to look good from the outside and we want people to think we're doing the right thing, we're a great company. But also they have some incentives within the business because we know finance drives most businesses, right? If it affects the bottom line, are people going to do it? No, they're probably not. They're just going to get on and crack on and do what's going to make them money. That's business is a business. They're there to make money there. So yeah. I think there needs to be more effort put into legislation and law and assistance with companies to actually follow through with it and deliver something.
David, we'll let you answer this here, but first let's get the poll so you can answer while the poll questions are going up. We'd like to have, because we still have a couple questions we'd like to ask. So number 5, I believe, is up, if it can come up. Okay, question 5, to what extent do you believe government policies in your region support sustainable digital infrastructure? David, go ahead and answer Ori's question.
Yeah, I'm going to answer Ori's question and speak to this too, because we have current experience in the local jurisdictions dealing with this. But I think, on one hand, we designed a worst case scenarios, right? But to Steve and Ori's point, there's the reality of the actual use. So right now, all the incentives are based on the design, right? If you could somehow align actual use with, and this gets into like the service level agreements that they have, and really maximize the use, take advantage of what we have, right? I mean, like I said, the latest statistic I've heard, don't quote me on this, is Ashburn, Virginia uses 35% of its available servers and power and data center floors. So I think that there's the opportunity right now. The jurisdictions tend to only focus on how big is your building, how loud is your building, how much emissions does your building submit when the generators are running, and generally how much electricity are you planning on using. But then nobody really goes back and says, how much do you actually use, right? And the incentive to maximize that, I think could be huge. But the other question that Ori asked, I think, increasing sustainability, I just feel like the industry is generally aligned to increase sustainability. Can we use data to better maximize that effort? Absolutely. But I think you already have a good start because it will only be more profitable, right? Okay. It will only be better. To the question about jurisdictions, they are, we just did some work with the local jurisdiction here, one of the counties, to help them sort of understand, the realities of a data center. And they have a lot of misconceptions that they hear, like they use too much water, which in some areas that's a big issue. In Northern Virginia, it's not. A lot of these data centers use no water. So we're constantly educating people on that.
Okay. I have to butt in because we're
sure.
So 55% of the people say their governments are actually supportive. 17%, 1/7 said they're not, and 28% said that it's kind of neutral. We could bring up question number 6 and answer that, and we're going to run out of time. So I want to stress to everyone who's watching, if you'd like to talk to any of our panelists, please contact IDCA, and we'll make them aware of that. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Someone did ask whether PUE is still important, and I think yes, basically, but there's a lot more to it than that. Does your organization have a dedicated strategy or plan for integrating sustainability into digital infrastructure? This is similar to a question we asked at the beginning, but now that we've had an hour to talk about it, we're interested in asking it in a slightly different way. 56% are saying we have some strategies, but they are not comprehensive. So you say, a lot of self-motivation here, could always do better, I think, to your point. No, we're planning to develop one. That sounds what I used to tell my dad, right? Did you get the lawn mowed? No, but I'm thinking about it. We have no plans to develop one, only 11%. So basically we have a super majority of people who are saying, yeah, we have a plan, we're developing one, and we think it's important. Could ask one more question, question number 7. And this will be something to leave us with. After attending this webinar, do you feel more informed? Okay, here's our test, guys. Do you feel more informed about the link between digital infrastructure and sustainability? Okay, it's okay. You know, if they give the wrong answer to this, we just won't let them attend again. No, that's a joke. We have 88%. 88% have said they are either significantly more informed or somewhat more informed. 14% that said there's no change. And so for those people, please feel free to contact us, because in this hour, as you can tell, we could just scratch the surface of what all 3 of these people know and the knowledge that they have with their colleagues and their customers. So we're going to ask you to please address any more questions to us. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I know all 3 of you have many more things to say, but we've just run out of time, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you down the road as we can expand on what we've done today. I always have to mention we have other webinars. We do these on usually the 3rd Wednesday of every month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Next month, because of the holidays approaching, we're going to go on the 2nd Wednesday. So December 13, we're going to talk about the impact of AI on the industry, both technical and ethical. I was surprised to see that actually real world operators have a lot of very strong opinions about the ethical use of AI in this industry across a wide range. So I urge everyone to attend that. Our 3 panelists may have stuff to say about that as well to me later on. But for now, everyone, thank you for joining. I'm sorry we have to go, but we do. And I look forward to seeing all of you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.